It's now my pleasure to introduce the increasingly popular hosts of our Research Rumble, Danielle and Jess. Jess Vice is an independent UX researcher and strategist, currently the fractional director of UX at Orca Creative. Jess founded multiple UX teams and mentored UXers one-on-one for more than 10 years. Danielle Green is a co-founder of the Guild and research director. She's a former research and product manager and currently professor of applied psychology and director of Claremont Graduate University's UX Master's Program. How did we get two such remarkable, talented people leading this session? Very good fortune, I would say. I will now turn the time over to Danielle and Jess. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raymond, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. If you haven't been to a Rumble before, this is what you can expect today. So we take the first 10 to 15 minutes, give a little bit of an introduction, what to expect at a Rumble. And Jess and I take opposing sides of the topic. So the topic today being evangelizing research, whose job is it? So we'll summarize all of that. After the intro, we send you all out into breakout rooms to discuss the topic in small groups. After that, we all come back together and have a shared discussion as a larger group, share ideas that came up, kind of elevate everybody's understanding of the conversation. And then finally, if you want to stick around, like Raymond said, we host these optional breakout sessions for networking. So let's get started. What is a Rumble? When most of us think of Rumble, you probably think of a boxing match. That is a little bit of false advertising on our part, because we are using Brené Brown's definition of a Rumble, which is really like a safe space to hash out a problem in a respectful and open-minded way. So although researchers are historically a rowdy bunch, haha, joke, big joke, funny joke, we do ask that you show up to the conversation ready to listen to each other, try on new perspectives, stay curious. This is also meant to be a participatory event. So you'll be in small group discussions. We invite you to participate to your comfort level, whatever that means for you. Finally, I reserve the right to boot any disrespectful folks out of the call. It hasn't happened yet. Don't be the first. Jess, is there anything you would add to setting up the Rumble here today?
I think the only other thing I'd say is that this is all in good fun. None of us claim to have 100% true answers, right? This is just like everything in UX, it all depends. So we're here to compare and maybe hear new perspectives, open our minds up a little bit.
Yeah, well said. Great. So with that in mind, Jess and I are going to summarize the opposing viewpoints on evangelizing research findings. I'm going to start off with the arguments in favor. And I also kind of wanted to maybe set up for a couple sentences here. The controversy is not whether you should communicate findings to stakeholders or whether you should help your stakeholders take action on your findings. That's not the controversy. That's not the debate here. The debate is really around whether evangelizing, or like the new term that I hear most often is socializing research findings. So pushing research findings out very proactively and convincing your stakeholders that your research findings are valid and that they should be acted upon. Is evangelizing part of your job? And said another way, said a way that might be a little bit more rousing, is should your performance as a professional be measured based on whether stakeholders adopt your findings? See where we're going? Yes. So this is how this back and forth tends to arise from this kind of conversation. Okay, so with that, I'm going to start off with the pros. Arguments in favor of research evangelization as part of your job. So my first point here is, what better success metric to be judged off of? If it were something like the number of tests that you conduct in a quarter, as opposed to whether your research findings are adopted by stakeholders, I think we can all see how that could be problematic, right? So if I'm held to the standard of conduct 10 tests a quarter, that's not a direct line to impact so much as being judged based off of whether my findings are informing decisions and being adopted by stakeholders. So I would say that like being held accountable for research findings being adopted, it's the better metric to use. It leads to impactful work, and it avoids that dynamic of research as a service. So where you're a centralized team and you're sort of working a queue of random projects that come your way and throwing the findings over the fence, kind of disincentivizes that dynamic, which I think is preferred. Okay, so there's that point. Next point is gonna ruffle some feathers. Hang in with me. So time spent in meetings can be valuable. Thank you for laughing, a couple of you. I would say that one of the arguments is we spend so much of our time in meetings as opposed to doing the actual work. My argument to that is it better to do 5 research projects in a quarter and be in minimal meetings, but with minimal adoption on those 5 projects? Or is it better to do one project a quarter, but with nearly 100% adoption and spending a lot of your time in meetings? I would argue that the latter's the better outcome. I would also just say, like, yeah, being in meetings, maybe 60% of your time, kind of gonna be what it is. I hear this from software engineers a lot, like, don't you want me coding? It's like, well, I kind of want you building the right thing. So same kind of argument, I think, holds true here. The next issue that I think comes up a lot is, look, not everybody can be a master of persuasion. We're not all extroverted, charismatic, gift of gab kind of humans, right? So does that mean that good, skilled researchers don't have a place in the workplace, in the organization, just because maybe they're less persuasive? And my counter to that is maybe we look at team level performance. So not everyone is going to be that persuasive, convincing individual. And not everybody has to be if someone on the team is owning that. And maybe it's like a team lead or a manager who's owning that evangelizing as on behalf of the team members who maybe are not as skilled in that way, or don't have a natural affinity for that. So that's one way that problem can be addressed, I think. Final point, strongest point, hardest point. Folks, you're gonna be held accountable for it anyway. Like, whether they tell you that convincing stakeholders is a part of your job or not, if there's another round of layoffs and no one on that team, on that panel, at that table can think of a time when a decision was made based off of research findings, your team is a candidate for getting laid off. And it's a hard truth. And I think evangelizing, it's about convincing stakeholders to adopt things, but it naturally also leads to high visibility within the organization, which does you a lot of favors when people are trying to remember what's the last thing the research team did. So again, hard truth, but maybe the strongest point there is you're actually going to be judged off of this anyway, whether they tell you you are or not. So might as well own it and decide it's a part of your practices. Okay, so there are the arguments I put together in favor. I'm going to pass the mic over to Jess to summarize against.
Thanks, Danielle. It's so funny. We always do these separately from each other, and it's so interesting how we come up with almost directly opposing points. So where are my elder millennials? Remember, but I am tired. It's the end of the world. So take a nap and then go research, evangelize your research anyway, right? We have to do it. It's part of your job. I think your point, Danielle, about team level assessment is really intelligent. I think that there needs to be a role for research evangelist. This is not my idea. This is Janelle Ward's, but she has written this really great piece talking about how I'm already doing all of the research, which we all know all the details, right? It's like herding cats to begin with. And then you want me to shout from the rooftops the amazing things that I'm doing and why they're valuable. I'm really tired. I don't have time. I'm working 8 hours a day and I really don't want to work more. That was the contract I signed on for. So Janelle says, we need research evangelists because we're not preaching to the converted. First, we must convert. And I think there's a difference here in UX research versus other research areas like scientific research or academic research. Those folks have already started a body of known work about the thing, right? Alzheimer's researchers, there's a whole bunch of research that they're adding to, and people who are looking at it believe in the value of the thing that they're already seeing. So when a new person comes in and says, oh, here's some more information, everyone's excited to receive it. User research is very, very different. We have to convert people in the first place to the value of research, of how awesome it is and what it can do for you and why we need this body of work. And then we also have to say, oh, that study I just did is super important, and here's why. So we're shooting for sea change. And I think when one person is responsible for sea change, you're going to drown, to take that metaphor too far. But it would be great if there would be another person whose whole role was to go and evangelize for us, right? This advocate or this ally that goes out and does the job and they get paid. And like Danielle was saying, that works really well with skill sets. If I'm not a talker, I don't love being in front of people, then asking me to research or to evangelize my own research is exhausting. So pay someone who's good at that. Let them do the talking. I think the next point folds into this really nicely. Think about where researchers often are in the company org. We're usually at the bottom. We're not often at the table. We're not often sitting with high-level decision makers. Research often is peer-to-peer. I think one of the very first comments in the chat was, I have to talk to my cross-functional teams and convince them to believe that this is good. Like we spend a lot of our time in these sideways relationships trying to get folks around us to understand, and then to be expected to also have impact on the executive level or on a place where we don't even have access to. So if my influence stops at my direct manager and they don't agree with me, I'm kind of screwed. How am I supposed to be accountable for something that I was never set up in the first place to have any impact on? So I think that organization plays into it. If we had, I'm going to go back to this research evangelist idea. If we go back to that role, suddenly that person has more access than I do as just a run-of-the-mill bottom of the pool researcher. And then as I was researching this, of course, every article said, oh, just make the process more collaborative. But I would argue, point 3, that's increased cost and time. Have you put 2 C-levels, a couple designers, a developer, a product manager, and some analytics people in a room before and tried to get anything done? And then also you add that, like, let's have all of them sit and watch a research interview. Let's say I have to take an hour to train all of them on how to do that appropriately so they're not interrupting and that we all understand the goal and why we're doing this and our techniques that we're going to use. And then I put them all in there and they have such different perspectives that we're chasing rabbit holes. Well, what about this and what about that? Or they interrupt, and I'm herding cats. So my job just got exponentially more difficult. Plus all of those salaries in the same room for 2 hours is the most expensive meeting you've held in months. I'm not sure why we would do that. And what often happens, I don't know about you, but in my experience, what often happens in that scenario is when we make it collaborative, people tend to criticize the methodology rather than the results. And we start and like we end up taking ourselves back to square one. I came in, I established the research process. We have all agreed on this and we've been doing it for months. And then suddenly an executive is like, wait, why are we doing it this way? No, the point was that we want you to listen to what this user is saying. And so we basically undermine everything that we sort of laid out to begin with. The value of what we're creating is lost, and we have to start over with establishing the value of our process, which could be beneficial if you're trying to evangelize research and get people to understand. But I think in the immediate context of a research scenario, that just ruins everything we've been setting up in the first place, right? There's a different time and place for talking about methodology and figuring out why and how we do things. That interview with a user, we want them to feel the pain points. We want them to have immediate impact from the things that we're trying to change. And this last point, I was raised Southern Baptist, y'all. We had revivals where preachers came and gave fiery sermons for several days in a row, and I can feel most of you cringing already. Like, nobody wants to be evangelized to. I think maybe this whole conversation is a little misguided and that we need to take a really big step back and just say, is evangelizing the right tactic in the first place? That's preachy. If you think about, let's say, like the Google Analytics expert at your company decides that everybody needs to understand, excuse me, everybody needs to understand their most important KPIs and why Google Analytics is important. And they start running around shouting from the rooftops how awesome GA is. And you should learn GA4 with me. All of us would be turned off, except the two data nerds, right? They're like, oh, yes, more data. So why are we doing that to our audiences? Our whole claim as researchers is that we understand people, we understand methods of communication, we understand how to prove value in relevant ways in order to make large scale outcomes. I'm not sure evangelizing is the right approach. I think the word is wrong. I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. We're setting aside our critical thinking skills. We're setting aside our empathy that we all claim really closely to be a key skill that we have when we say we're gonna preach the truth of research. It's, what if there's a different word? What if there's a different way? What if we used our own research methods that we use for the company externally, internally, on the way that we message the things that we're finding and that we're trying to get implemented? So I'm gonna shut up because I'm really curious what y'all think.
That was great. Okay, well, I think we set up a good set of things for everyone to discuss. So you've got a lot of fuel for whatever fire it is that you have inside you. I'm going to open up the breakout rooms now and let folks join. So enjoy your conversation. One tip, reduce the introductions that you give each other because that can take up a lot of time. Save that for the networking breakout sessions later. So stick to the topic at hand. Great. You're free to go.
And so in our group, we talked about, you know, how the impetus for all that really is on our shoulders as researchers. And for me, it's about just trying to communicate the value of research and trying to understand other people's limited knowledge of research and some of the time horizons and so on and so forth. You know, because sometimes you're trying to convey value in terms of there not being a direct output. Like, I saved the organization a bunch of money because we didn't build this thing because it doesn't make sense, right? Or we're not adding more complexity to our platform or whatever that may be. And that's hard, and I think it takes time. But to me, it seems like it's just sort of implicit in the role, unless there's enough maturity to get to that level where we can have somebody doing that higher level work, which sounds fun. I would love to take on that role myself, but
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Doug mentioned in the comments, thank you. Doug mentioned in the comments earlier that maturity plays a huge part in this whole discussion, right? If your org is super new and doesn't understand UX at all or research at all, it's going to be a completely different discussion. Eric, I like your idea of maybe there's a strategist at a high level who's helping tie that alignment across the organization and say like research is doing this because someone else, I think Abby mentioned, and Abby, I don't want to jump ahead of you, but in the comments, Abby said, well, what about if the dev is incentivized by velocity? Like there's a whole lot of factors here. So maybe that strategy, or instead of the evangelist, it's the strategist person who stays at the high level and says, oh, leadership, you need to see this and this, and this is how all the pieces are working together. Abby, go ahead. I'm curious what you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think for one thing, in our group, we all agreed communication is what needs to happen all the time. And I feel that unless our incentives are aligned, we're running on different roads, and it's really hard to do that, a collaboration. So communication is one thing, but collaboration, like truly agile, like we would all be running together and have the same goal, but that's not always how teams are set up. So if you're in a situation where you're forced to evangelize or sell research, you might want to talk to leadership about how the teams are structured and how the functionality is working, because you might just be, like we've been talking about, in a situation where you're going to be bumping your head against the wall unless already you're set up for success.
Yeah, so it's an organizational structure problem and like a goals problem that we're setting the wrong targets for people if we want them to be aligned.
Yeah, and teams working together.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Mhm.
Claire, go ahead.
Yeah, so my team, we kind of focused the first half of the discussion around terminology. We kind of came to a consensus that evangelizing feels a little icky, and that maybe another term that we could use, something that's more familiar with the industry, is the term championing, or being a champion of, right? So that was kind of the first part. And then the second was really, going back and forth about whose role is it, like, and what are these pros and cons. My kind of big takeaway, I think, is that, in a perfect world, it'd be wonderful to have that strategist level, the person who's kind of there and like making all of this come together. But then who's championing for that role? So it's like, I think at some point we are always going to have to come back to the fact that, to some degree, it's going to be on us to do this evangelizing or championing, to some level.
Yeah, until we see orgs that are built from the ground up with research as a key piece of the decision-making team, right? Like until that happens, we're kind of always going to be shouting for our own worth. Cool, thank you. Chris, go ahead.
It makes me sad that solving the right problem isn't seen as having that much value. I mean, everyone working or saying, the engineers put out code for a new feature that designers have, and you have a physical asset to show them. I would say, all that time and people's work on that, and then having to redo it because you were solving the wrong problem, that's a lot of money and time. Because of my marketing background, it occurred to me perhaps maybe partnering with marketing within your organization to champion and socialize the findings and insights, and make, it takes time to create visuals to really have people wrap their heads around it. And if there's pushback and maybe, they're not open to it, perhaps you can, hopefully there's also market researchers within your organization that you can have that in and say, internal marketing is also very important to get everybody on the same page. And also thinking about, and strategizing more.
Yeah, I think too, there's an interesting point to be made that it doesn't have to be the marketing team, right? It's almost like I'm queer, so I think about where are my allies in an organization, and I think it can be a very similar conversation for researchers. Who benefits from the work that I'm doing? If it's the devs every time, can I get them to speak up for me? Do they have somebody on the decision-making level who is excited about this? Like, I think it can even become a conversation of just allyship. Who loves research? Go ahead.
Oh, that's a great point. I was just saying that when we were talking about not everybody is persuasive or outgoing, I mean, that's marketing's job.
Yeah.
So, and they should be good at, so why not lean on them and partner with them if you don't have the bandwidth to take on that extra load.
Yeah, especially for the visual and sort of poppy internal ways of hearing the message in posters and that kind of cool stuff that we don't typically do. Awesome. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, just because you were talking about marketing, we had a conversation in our group, is that sometimes like people don't really understand UX research per se, but they understand other forms of information gathering, such as market research and what have you. And so in a less mature organization, we get asked to see, provide for that. And I think, we began exploring this idea that like in the end, we're talented at being able to find out information and answer questions. That's really what it boils down to. And there's just sort of these different vectors that people are coming to answer these questions. So why not join in, and maybe we do some market research, even though that's not really our thing, but like we carve out a little bit of that research time to answer some of our own sort of user-focused kind of objectives. And so it's a way through doing that. I mean, you're kind of blurring the lines a little bit, but it is an opportunity to create relationships. And if you are working with, marketing or whatever, I mean, I really love that idea about empowering the talents and skills of other people in your organization to help you tell that story. And it doesn't just have to be like sort of an evangelist, although I love that idea too, but just the idea of the skills of visually presenting in a compelling way what we've learned.
Yeah. Yeah. I think part of what you said there is answering other people's interests or other groups, other teams' interests, even if they're not the thing that we're trying to get done. It's sort of that PR principle of give, give, get. If I can give you a little bit of information that you care about and I can give you a way to implement it, you start to see my value, even though it's not the thing I really wanted you to pay attention to. I'm building that relationship. I love the relationship approach too. Reggie, go for it.
Maybe it was what you said, Jess, earlier, that you were raised in the South, or was that you? Yeah, I was raised in North Carolina, so the whole evangelizing, I've spent many a night at revivals. But I don't necessarily have a problem with the word. I've been in the industry for over 20 years, so I've been in different types of organizations, different types of setups, and where I've had to, especially as working as an IC, where I've had to tell a great story to have influence. And over the years, I've just come to realize that as a researcher, it's just up to me to tell the best stories I can about the work that I'm doing, about what I'm learning about, to have the type of influence I want to have, no matter where I've been. Even working in a consultant agency I worked in for about 3.5 years. I don't think we should, and I know this is probably a contrarian point of view, but I don't think we should shy away from the types of words that have been used, even evangelizing, or promoting or marketing. At some point, you're going to have to stand in front or be in a room of people to share a point of view about some work that you've done as a researcher. And it's going to be up to you to tell that story in the best way possible, to have the influence you want to have. Whether you think you're evangelizing or not, you kind of are, because that person that's receiving that information is going to have to, they're going to want to believe it. You're going to want them to believe it or not. They're going to either believe it or not. So tell the best stories you can, do the best research you can, make sure that you're presenting the work to the right people that need to hear it, and tell the best story the best way you can. I think that you'll have success.
That's awesome. I think that's a good point. And I think that maybe one of the things that we can take away from that is, out of those employee development hours, I can ask for storytelling guidance. I can ask for coaching on how to take my passion and form it into something that other people will respond to, right? Instead of saying it's up to the organization to listen to me, I can even say, like, actually, maybe I'm not great at telling stories, and I could hone those skills a little more in order to be more effective to reach people. Cool. Thank you. That's awesome. Ashley, mentioned in the chat earlier, and I loved this, that she talked about the idea of adoption of research findings is also hard to define. That if research taught us that the solution would need to change in order to meet a need, and the PMs decide that that isn't the priority, then our work informed that decision. And I think Eric alluded to this. Our work informed that decision, but they chose not to build it. That we have to spin that story. We have to figure out how to say it wasn't adoption of research necessarily, it was impact of research. I saved us money by not building this thing, or I recommended that we did do this, but, and I've been in this situation, I'm curious how y'all handle this, where I am advocating for my research. I am saying very clearly, we need to do X, and I've written it down on purpose so that there's a paper trail. And the rest of the teams go, no, we're not going to do that. And later there's that I told you so moment, where research actually was right. That looks bad, right? That's bad politics. It just feels relational and icky. And I'm curious if that works into evangelizing for you, or if adoption is maybe not part of this conversation. That was a big question and kind of weirdly worded. If you don't want to answer and you want to talk about something else, totally open. I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Could you ask it again? Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. So Ashley talked about adoption, right? That we had said, I think one of the pros was that we will be measured on the adoption of our research. But a lot of times we advise something and the teams don't take the advice. So there's this sort of I told you so moment of research said it would go this way. You chose not to. I'm measured on adoption, but you didn't adopt what I said. Or I told you not to do this thing, and so we saved a bunch of money, but how, like, that's not adoption. What is that? How does that play into evangelizing if I'm promoting research, but then people are, I'm not asking this well. I'm struggling with the brain space today to turn that into another question. I'm just curious about that piece of being measured on adoption when teams don't listen to what research is saying.
Yeah, and I think actually that happens more often for me than than the alternative, right? Like, okay, folks, we're going with option A. Research says that's risky, and we're taking the risk. And everyone goes, uh-huh. And then we take the risk, and then, you know, we realize some consequences to that risk. And is that not success? We communicated the risk. Everyone made the informed decision to trade, to take the risk. Is that not success? Yeah, I'm showing my cards a little bit on my personal views here.
You're good. Go ahead, Ramsey.
I was sort of thinking about this too. I think it's interesting when you have, here, I'll go on camera for my comments. When you have recommendations that aren't adopted, and you kind of see, I just had a few UI tests and go through, and it's the choices for the next iterations were, you know, some of them, you know, there are variables of different data points that were tested, didn't go through to the next level. So I feel like a lot of times it's not even a consultation, or, you know, there's a conversation that research is not a part of. And sometimes those choices to move forward, you know, who knows who's in those conversations. And even the tests that I've been most recently executing have been from the executive team directly. We need this in 3 days, kind of things. And we're going to choose to test this, even though it tested poorly in the last round of tests. You know, so sometimes even those like higher level, like, I just like this, so test it again. Kinds of things. So I think there's always a challenge to, like, you don't want to like necessarily call anybody out, especially, you know, if you're kind of in this hierarchy. But, you know, it's sort of interesting to be like, huh, we're testing on these things that tested poorly, or the things that tested well for the second round are not being, you know, moved over. And I think this also points into another question, not to answer the question with a question, but how do you measure the impact of research, or coming back to research that has been put out to find out. I think this has been an age-old question in UX research. Like a lot of times I know, you know, especially when I'm interviewing for new jobs, they're like, what was the impact of your research? And I'm like, you know, sometimes there's a clear win where you're like, I said to, the research said to do this and we did it. And then sometimes there's not a clear win. And it's also, there's not a lot of measurements or ways, that have gone back later to measure the research and its impact. So I'm sorry, like I said, I'm sorry to answer a question with a question, but.
No, you're good. I was sort of out there too, but I think this is interesting to think about because there's so many ripple effects of the idea of evangelizing, and then how do we measure the success of it, and how many parts of our job does it touch? Eric, go ahead and see if there's anything you can add.
Yeah, I really love this part of the conversation. And I don't want to, or I want to give credit. This is a metaphor that I'm taking from Zoe Glass, and I hope I'm not butchering their name either. But they were proposing the idea of an ecosystem manager as a kind of metaphor in terms of like, if you want to increase the wolf population, here's potentially what's going to happen, if we're going to focus our efforts there. And I think somebody in the chat just mentioned about trade-offs. And so I think for me as well, part of the difficulty I think I have in communicating research at times is a perceived lack I'm sensing myself of like spatial and temporal awareness, meaning if we build this into the system, what are the implications going to be, not just tomorrow, but a year down the road? Like, is this something that we want to put in, or do we not want to put this in, or is this creating complexity and different effects that we're, and are these going to emerge at higher levels spatially than we're even thinking about now? And so I think there's just always more to contemplate, but super hard to tie that directly to impact. Like, how do you convey that, particularly in these sort of bite-sized nuggets? So yeah, not a good answer to anything, just more provocations, I think, around that.
Great, thank you. Abby, go ahead. We'll take you and Doug, and I think we're going to wrap because we're real close to the hour.
So I'm thinking about the roles of design research versus UX research.
Mm-hmm.
I think we think of UX research as usability testing and testing things that are the concepts that are existing, and the why those concepts are there, who are they for, and why are they there, is a thing you can take into the study as this is what we're assessing against. People are supposed to be able to do X, Y, and Z, and they can't do it. They can't find the button or whatever. Those are not strategic findings, they're incremental findings. And the biggest impact that we can have are adding up all those incremental findings and describing strategy and saying, if we build this way, this many users are not going to be able to find the button, they're all going to drop. And we're able to find the why with the big data. And when you ever can get in a position of, you see data scientists analyzing or product analysts analyzing the throughput of the product or whatever it is, and they're like, nope, we see this happening and this is not happening. They usually don't know why. But it's our job as qualitative researchers to go in there and find those people who are not doing what they want us to do or doing something weird, and learning from them. And then you understand the why, and that unlocks all kinds of stuff for the whole team. So being able to demonstrate that kind of value, even if you're in a position of being boxed into just doing usability study or concept testing of things that are already there, you can really build some value in the organization by starting to speak about strategic things. And then there's also the knowledge of doing generative research to inform the product teams about what to build for who and why. And that's a different type of research, right? It's like new, and you're getting new ideas, and it's more easily strategic. So I've always had to I've always had to convince, to sell the value of generative research, because a lot of times we as UX researchers, that name implies that it's user experience. It's not necessarily the big strategy things.
Right, or unknown things. Yeah. Yeah, I love that perspective of, we deal with the small details, but always have the big picture in mind, kind of balancing those two.
And you can build on those small incremental things you can build to understand and have
Mhm.
a expertise that not everyone has.
Awesome. Thank you. Doug, go for it. Wrap us up.
Yeah, I guess maybe hopefully this is a good way to wrap up. You just never know when your research can be acted upon. So I did a diary study back in, I remember, fall of 2020. And in the course of that diary study, we were examining how people were using our search to examine a big library of content that we have. And so we were really focused on the search experience, but we learned some things about what people were doing with the stuff that they found after the search. And some of it was fairly ineffective and inefficient. And so I brought that up during the course of our research findings, and people were like a lot of head nodding and saying, oh, that's interesting. And nothing happened for 2 years. And then a team had time to do some innovation. They had like an innovation sprint, and they said, we have the capacity to tap into AI, and it might be able to address that problem that was brought up 2 years ago during that diary study. And from that, we introduced something within our product suite, which it isn't widely adopted, but for the people who are using it, they're like, this is just making my life so much faster in using this. And it's like, wow, I never would have expected that. I never expected that finding to potentially lead to this result, but like, so I just say plant the seeds, and I guess it gets to the challenge of being measured against that impact.
Mhm.
So it is messy, but speak up.
Great. I love the image to end on of gardening, that we're more gardeners than we are evangelists, maybe, of planting seeds, tending things that are already growing, choosing what to cull, choosing what produces and what is just going to be there for beauty and for, later. Some things take really long time to grow. Some things are quick, responsive, productive. That's interesting. I'm gonna play with that a little bit more. Awesome. Danielle, you want to take us to the last couple minutes?
Yeah, so thank you everyone for this discussion. This was wonderful. So we do have our giveaway, and we did choose Abby Ripstra. So we will be in touch. As you live in the US, right?
San Francisco. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, we'll send you the book.
Okay.
Okay, we will stick around for another 5 or 10 minutes for folks who want to do some additional networking. But for everybody here today, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks.